And so we're going to have two sessions on the allocation of expenditure and revenue responsibilities. It's a question that many of you have asked, you're very interested, who should do what on raising resources and spending resources and why. So the first session, the first session before lunch, we're going to talk about general principles, the logic and empirical observation from around the world on what happens in practice versus the theory. And then we're going to apply this to three examples from Asia. We will look at Ho Chi Minh City, Shanghai, and Jakarta. So we'll look at where these cities get their money and what do they spend it on. And that will be the session after lunch. The first issue in general is you might do something different on the revenue side versus the expenditure side. For example, you might continue to centralize certain revenue functions while you decentralize expenditure decisions. For relatively complicated taxes or taxes that are difficult to do locally, you might want to have centralized administration or with perhaps some tax sharing arrangement where local government helps the central government and keeps some of the taxes. And you want to make sure the important big taxes are implemented the same way everywhere in the country, consistently, fairly, and equitably. And if different local governments have different capacities, again, you might want to have the general administration centralized. For example, you heard yesterday in China with the VAT or the income tax, they're central taxes, but because local governments help with administration, they get to keep part of the revenue directly. And when I talk about the income tax tomorrow morning, I will explain in more detail why it's really a very difficult tax to be totally locally, but some sharing arrangement might help both the central government raise more money and use the skills and capacity of local government to help meet the targets. But when possible, it would be good to give local government some taxing authority so they become more accountable for how they spend the money. If you're taking money directly from the people locally, they're going to watch you more closely in what you do with the money. So this is why later in the week we have an entire session on the property tax. This is the most common local tax around the world. And when we talk about the property tax, we'll talk about why this is actually the most efficient. It's more efficient to do this tax at the local level than a higher level. But on the expending side, on resource allocation, as I said, one way to increase the accountability of the government is to share central taxes with local government. So what I'd like to do is to provide a list of resource allocation options, starting with the most decentralized to the most centralized. And the hope for local government is the first option, the most decentralized, where local government is totally responsible for design of the tax, implementation of the tax, enforcement of the tax, and complete control over use of the revenue. The most common example of this around the world, again, is the property tax, the tax on land and buildings. This is true, for example, in the United States. And I'll give you an example from Cambridge, where Harvard is located, when we do the property tax. So you define your tax base, what you will tax. You determine the tax rate. You do property valuation, determine the value of your tax base. You send the tax bills, and you're responsible for tax collection. You pay your tax money to local government. Do not pay, local government is responsible for sanctions, for enforcing. Local government decides by itself how to spend the money. This is difficult in many emerging economies because often the law says only the central government can tax, local government can collect fees and charges, but not taxes. And it's a bit of a complicated tax, so there is the issue of local government capacity to implement the tax fairly and accurately. But there are exceptions. And I will give you an exception tomorrow from Indonesia, which now has made the property tax entirely local. A transition strategy also used in Indonesia was to have co-administration of the tax between the central government and local government. So continuing with the example from Indonesia, the Ministry of Finance did the technical part like property valuation and tax calculation through their local offices. But the direct interaction with taxpayers was done by local government. For example, gathering information about the property so you can calculate the tax, helping to build awareness about why it's important to pay the tax and how it will benefit the local population, and helping to encourage voluntary compliance to pay the tax. And the central government only got a collection fee of about 10%. All of the rest of the revenue went to the provincial government, the state level, and local government. And we'll go more into detail about this example when we talk about the property tax. Another way of trying to involve local government and improving accountability is to essentially have a local addition to a central tax. For example, in the United States, there's an excise tax on gasoline. And it's a federal tax, a national tax, mainly to help provide maintenance for highways, for national highways. But there's also a state excise tax on fuel that's added on top, and you pay for it all at the same time. So if you go to the gas station and fill up your car, you just pay once, and it includes the excise tax, which is then divided by formula between the federal government and state. The consumer doesn't see any of that. Another example from the United States is between the state government and local government. This is what we call the retail sales tax. It's a consumption tax when you buy something. So again, if you go to the store and you buy something, there's tax added, but then there's a formula where the state gets part of it and local government gets part of it. So again, for the taxpayer, it's easy. They don't see the division of it, but it's a way of giving local and state government incentives and the benefits of this kind of tax on a tax. The next option we've already talked about, where it's a central government tax, but state or local government helps to collect it and in return gets to keep part of it directly. And you heard yesterday from the cases from Dr. Tuan that the revenue increased dramatically when China and also Vietnam switched to this system. And this is very attractive to local government because the money doesn't go to the capital, recorded as central money, and then reallocated. Often it doesn't come back, right? Or it comes back and it's much smaller. This you get directly. So it's often not booked as entirely central revenue, depending on your system of administration. But the advantage is that local governments, if they hope that it will go to the capital and then will be reallocated to them, you know it's a difficult process, often subject to a lot of negotiation. In this case, it's clear what your share is when it's collected. I'm listing the options because in Myanmar, if the government is reluctant to do 1 and 2, which is pretty much decentralizing taxing authority, either for political or capacity reasons, you have 2 other options that still give you a lot more share in revenue that you help collect and more revenue to use for local priority, short of decentralizing completely the taxing authority. And later this week, our teaching team will give you examples of several traditionally central government taxes where you can design them to give local government a greater share and a greater role in these taxes. And the last option is what we call revenue sharing, where a central tax, the central government collects the money and then reallocates it by some formula to local government. So remember, tax sharing off the top before it gets lost in the capital and the national budget. In this option, it all goes to central government, and then, as I said, through some type of transfer formula, you will get something back. And as we said yesterday, this is often the policy tool to equalize between rich areas and poor areas in a country. It's redistributive. And this is used to close what we call the fiscal gap when you have expenditure-led decentralization and local government doesn't have enough money to finance everything it's supposed to do under the new rules. And we will have an entire session later this week on designing these transfer formulas. So that's a general context of expenditure and revenue assignment, and it's a menu of your options that you might want to consider depending on the specific tax and local government capacity. So now we're going to be more specific about revenue and expenditure assignment. So of course, expenditure is allocating the budget. Revenue, of course, money does not grow on trees, but we're trying to create resources for development. Do you like this little fellow here? No. Assignment, who gets what? That's what this is. So first we'll look at expenditures, and then we'll look at revenue. And what I'm going to do is provide you with some guidelines, and then you are going to give me examples. And the examples can be from Myanmar or any other country you're familiar with. And these guidelines are just based on empirical observation from looking at what countries do around the world. So one type of expenditure that is usually national or central around the world is for infrastructure and services that go over local or state borders. Can you think of something the government builds or a service the government provides that goes over local or state borders? So this would be, for example, a national highway, like the expressway I took from Yangon to Naypyidaw, Express 1 or something. Yeah, exactly. So national highways would be a very good example. So in this case, it's not coming from the union budget, but it's co-financed between the two regions. That often causes a problem in other countries. You have 3 regions, and one region in the middle doesn't want to pay. So the highway stops, it starts and stops, or different quality. I know this happens in other countries, so it's what we call maybe a second best solution, but a stronger solution would be to have one source, maybe negotiate where the money comes from, but have one source to pay for it so that you have continuity and standardization throughout the country for the national road network. But the principle of a national highway is a very good example. Can somebody think of another example? Think in your mind what is normally in the national budget. Think about the sectors in the national budget normally. For example, we can see that higher education is often central, primary education can be local, teachers can be local but paid for by central. It's a mixed model. I'm trying to think of something that would almost always be 100% national. Another area would be a national entitlement program, either some type of national social insurance or a national welfare or social safety net program. Can you think of an example of a government entitlement program covering everybody who meets the qualifications? Can you think of an example? So America has Social Security for people who retire. We have Medicare, health insurance for people who retire. We have something called Medicaid, which is health insurance for low-income families. So basically, retirement programs or health programs would, I'll give you general worldwide experience. You always have exceptions, but if it covers the entire population and people move from state to state and they move around and they're mobile, you often want a national pension program, a national health program to be under central administration and funding.
Okay.
And this is not a law, these are not national rules, it's just common practice because it's logical. And there are always exceptions. Of course, national debt, if the government borrows by issuing bonds, for example, the government should pay back, right? So central government borrows, central government repays from general revenue. This is a little tricky. A contingent liability means the government must pay if something happens. That's contingent on something happening. For example, a state enterprise borrows. Maybe a state airline or power company, they borrow and there's no central government guarantee. There can be or not. But you know, even if there's no guarantee, you're not going to let the company go bankrupt if they cannot repay. So we say there could be an implicit guarantee. The market believes that you will repay whether you say you will or not. But there's nothing in the budget for this. You don't have a budget that says, if the enterprise cannot repay, I will repay. But the point is, whether they borrow directly, as national debt, or a state enterprise borrows and has problems, the central government will be responsible. State-owned enterprises, subsidies to state enterprises if they're not profitable. Spending to redistribute money from rich areas to poor areas. If you're the same level of government, one state cannot redistribute to another state. One local government cannot distribute to another local government. So if you're going to move money between levels of government, from rich to poor, it's almost always a national responsibility. And of course, if the economy is in trouble, for example, in recession, and you need a spending program to restart the economy, that's going to be a national stimulus package. So general practice around the world is everything listed is usually not state and local responsibility. So what does state and local government do around the world? So can you think of a subnational or single jurisdiction service or infrastructure? So we had national, like national highways. Can you think of something that local government, local or state, either builds or a service they provide? So when I say subnational, it could be state or any level of local, from Myanmar or another country. No monopoly. No. We want to have diversity. We love your enthusiasm, but I want to hear from some other people. They are what economists call free riding. They're taking advantage of you. Drainage systems. A national watershed might be a special authority, but I agree, regional or local drainage, wastewater, and often water, potable water. Very good examples. So sometimes you have programs to help the poor that are below the national level, especially in big cities. So they don't replace national entitlement programs, but sometimes they add to them. Of course, if local government borrows, they should be responsible for repaying their debt. And if there's a subnational government enterprise, for example, a local water company, if they cannot repay the debt, then it will go back to the local budget. And as I said, these are just some guidelines based on experience. They're not rules or best practices, they're just general guidelines. And we'll see after lunch in the 3 cities, what do they spend their money on. If you would like many more examples from the background reading, again, our dear friend Anwar Shah has a list of many, many other examples from around the world by sector and subsector. And he divides it into national, state, or province, local, and civil society. So let's look at the revenue side. What revenue sources generally are national versus subnational? So if you think of a tax that's based on ability to pay, so the richer you are, the more you pay, the poorer you are, the less you pay, that generally is a national tax. It's complicated, it's progressive. It's a little bit unfair because we haven't talked about specific taxes yet, but can you think of a tax generally that's based on your income or wealth? The more income or wealth you have, the more you pay. Income tax. Very good. I helped you a little. I said based on income. So income tax is usually a national tax, although sometimes there's a tax sharing arrangement, as we'll talk about. The second type, often countries with emerging economies are subject to capital flows going in and out very quickly, mainly from speculation. We are not talking about FDI that goes into the real sector. So sometimes the central government will have a small tax to make it more expensive to speculate. Taxes that require harmonization with other countries, like trade taxes, would be national. So number 4 is related to number 1. It's usually the same type of tax, like income tax. Can you move your income from one place to another? How many people think income is mobile? You can move it from place to place. Nobody? 1?
Yeah.
I'll ask again. Can I take my income and move it from Mandalay to Yangon to Hong Kong? Yeah.
Yes.
Can I change the form of my income from one form to another? Can I hide my income?
So,
It's very, very hard to tax income. It's mobile. It could change form. It could disappear. So you have to deal with the entire country and the entire world. Certain taxes, the tax base is not equally distributed around the country. Oil, gas, minerals, forests. And this is always a source of tension between central governments and subnational governments. Subnational says, it's here, it's mine. Central government said, we need this to redistribute to other places in the country. So it's usually national, but with some special negotiated agreement with the subnational government so they keep a larger share. Certain taxes can be local, but they produce so much revenue, the central government will not give it up. The value-added tax is an example, but you'll hear much more about that tomorrow. And then charges to use a national service like flying an airline or taking a ride on a national train. Basically, fees you pay to a state enterprise for their service. Somebody mentioned electricity earlier. If there's a state power company, you pay for the electricity, that would be an example. So the question for you, subnational governments, what's left? Central government took personal income tax, corporate income tax, value-added tax, trade tax, what's left? Of course, you first tried to get maybe tax sharing with the big taxes. But there might be something you can tax that's not mobile. We said income, you can move. You can change the form. You can hide it. Can you think of something that you cannot move and you cannot hide? Land and buildings, which brings us back to our beloved property tax. And you'll hear more about that later this week.
Right.
And property tax is also something that's based on residency or location. The geographic location is important. We talked about adding to national taxes, for example, the excise tax or sales tax examples I gave. And if subnational government is providing a service, we mentioned water or wastewater, for example, maybe trash collection. They can also charge for that. Subnational government really has four choices: tax sharing or adding to the tax from one of the national taxes. Option 3 is the property tax. And 4, of course, charging for services that you provide. And we'll see examples of these in the cases after lunch. And again, if you're interested in many more specific examples, our recommended reading by Anwar Shah has many more specific examples of revenue assignment. And I believe our time is just about up. So after lunch, we're going to take a visit to 3 countries, 3 cities in 3 different countries, to be more precise, thank you. Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, Shanghai in China, and Jakarta in Indonesia. You probably didn't expect to get a free trip to Asia as part of this program. So have a good lunch, and we'll see you after lunch. Thank you.